Where did it all begin? Is arguably one of the most quintessential questions that has carried the ultimate curiosity of all humankind over millenniums. With some of the most brilliant explorations that human brain and instincts ever undertook, which flowed into the founding of disciplines and schools of art, ideas, understanding, and technology alike that surround us now in our everydays, that we most fittingly refer to as the evolution of our civilization. We're after tracing some milestones of this ideal quest for this season of Zeroing In, the Science Podcast. Welcome to the fourth season, To a City. For the first episode, and following across a timeline across millennia, we set out to converse with an archaeologist to help us set the record straight by delving as far into the past as we can literally trace. Professor Kalyan Chakraborty is a researcher, excavator, and post-excavation analyst who specializes in biomolecular archaeology and archaeological geochemistry. Professor Chakraborty pursued his bachelor's in anthropology from the University of Calcutta and then went on to pursue his master's degree specializing in ancient Indian history and culture from the Deccan College. Following this, he pursued his doctoral work at the University of Toronto, wherein he conducted really interesting research in the field and as an analyst as well. Following his postdoctoral stints across various institutes and field sites, he is currently an assistant professor at the Ashoka University and is associated as a postdoctoral researcher with the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History. We discussed with him on fundamental ideas about the understanding of human history from anthropological and archaeological points of reference, the names of knowns while tracing the story of the development of human civilizations from scientific perspectives, and perhaps more importantly, naming the unknowns that still beg for an understanding of where we belong. Professor Chakraborty's patient art of storytelling combined with the extensive understanding of the nuances of the field made the conversation extremely lively and beautifully lined with treasures of fundamental ideas spilling into further ardent curiosity trails that we promise to follow along really soon. Your hosts for this episode are Muskan Garg, who pursued her bachelor's in history from Delhi University and is currently pursuing her master's in liberal arts from Ashoka University, and I am Naman Jain for the fourth season of Zeroing In, the Science Podcast. So first off, I really just wanted to ask you about the broadest excitements of the field. I mean, when we talk about archaeology, the first thought is about all things old and ancient and how actually humans started with anything at all, right? But admittedly, there's really little common knowledge that exists in the society in general that is solidly based on facts and scientific ideas, I guess. And I just wanted to ask you about the broader excitements for you when you were probably in school or college, or how did it really begin for you?
Okay, before I begin with my journey, I think one thing that needs to be debunked at the very first is that archaeology is rarely something that you see in the movies. We do work with mummies, but then we don't fight with mummies for sure. We don't go hunt for treasure, and when we find something shiny, we don't just take it and run. 90% of the archaeologists are poor fighters, so we don't go and fight with normal people or anybody for that matter. So it's like any other academic discipline that you can imagine. It's a very well established discipline. It definitely started as a treasure hunt, but then in this 21st century, it is a very well developed field. It's like any other physics, chemistry, biology, whatever field you think. It has its own sets of questions that we ask, that archaeologists generally ask. It has its own sets of methodologies that we use. It also has its own sets of theoretical understanding. So that kind of theories we use. Me coming to archaeology was kind of accidental and, kind of a destiny. I never had a plan to, come to archaeology. And I think when the movie like Mummy get released, I was pretty adult at that point of time. So it was not that I saw a movie and then I got influenced to do archaeology. During my graduations, I did anthropology. So I had a BSc degree in anthropology, and that was the first time I got introduced something remotely with archaeology. That was so we had a course on prehistoric anthropology. So we learned about human evolution and got associated with material culture that generally ancient humans have used. But then also me coming to anthropology was accidental or like unintentional, because I didn't score a lot well in my plus two, so that was the safest choice for me. So I took anthropology. I liked prehistoric anthropology, but then I was more interested in socio-cultural anthropology. But then I actually tried to think like, when did I actually decide to go into archaeology? And I couldn't think the exact time or exact thought that I had. But I think it was like kind of grown into me, and then I thought, okay, let's do a master's in archaeology, and then I did master's in archaeology. And then pretty much at that point of time, I had nothing else to do, so I did my PhD. Because I wasn't sure of writing competitive exams and go for government jobs. I hated that from the very beginning, so that was not something I wanted to do. So I didn't want to go for banking. So I think it's the safest choice. Let's go for a PhD, and then I went for a PhD. Now I do archaeology, and often in India, it's kind of, over the world, it's like archaeology is either associated with history, or it is associated with anthropology. So either it is part of humanities or it is part of social science. In India, it's kind of in the middle. So we have separate archaeology departments. It is also part of anthropology departments, and in some parts of India, it is also part of history departments. So we have like best of all kind of a scenario over here. So my association with history was like really poor. The two subjects that I hated during my school was history and chemistry. Those are like, I never scored good in any of those subjects, and I just read to pass. And then it's called destiny that now I'm teaching in a history department and doing research in archaeological chemistry. So, so this is how I basically came to archaeology. But then when I started doing archaeology, there was a lot of fun. It was not a very regimented subject that you would otherwise think. There was a lot of scope to think. There was a lot of scope to do the kind of work you want to do in your own way. So there was not prescribed way that you have to do certain things in certain way. So you can choose the way you want to do. You can choose the topic you want to do. And archaeology being so huge, okay, so pretty much anything that a human do today, they have also done it in the past. So anything that you can associate with human, you can also associate with past human. So the scope of research is extensive. And then there was this puzzle solving thing that was pretty exciting for me, is that if you love to solve puzzles, and if you get excited, not only solve puzzle but also find that there is a puzzle, and then I have to solve it. So that was quite interesting for me, and then that's how I got stuck into archaeology. And I think that was the best decision I have ever made in my life, and I thoroughly enjoy the work I do.
Well, when you say this, it actually sounds like it was not calculative at the beginning, right? I mean, as and how we see people going about their career choices right now, it's extremely calculative. That, okay, this is the step, and then this is the clear step, and then further and further and further. At least in the academic side, more so, I think in artistic side, that is probably how it works. But in academic side, when someone is taking things up, it's extremely calculative, or so it seems at least. So that I imagine wasn't the case for you, right?
No, and I'll give you an archaeological answer to this question. As archaeologists, we often contradict an evolutionary interpretation of human behavior, that humans are generally non-calculative. Okay, we don't always take calculative decisions, and most of the breakthroughs we had as humankind were uncalculative. So I'm pretty sure that we take as many uncalculative decisions as we take calculative decisions, and they're all part of your life. So yeah, I'm happy that I haven't taken a calculative decision.
Indeed, but also the ideas that we were discussing while diving into the topic for the conversation were all over the place and about all sorts of things. And what boggled our minds was how little we know as common people. And perhaps we do not have any clue about if there really is, after all, a conclusive story of the human civilization and how did it really start, or if there really is a point from which you can clearly and credibly say that this is where we know things from. Would you like to briefly walk us through that and tell us about on how far back can we go in the idea of the story of civilizations, and from which point on do we really know? And is there something like a common story of things from there on?
I'll try to answer it. So if I lose my way and go somewhere else, bring me back and say, okay, you're going a little further from the question. So as archaeologists, we have found things, we have studied things, we're finding things, and we're studying things. Our ideas are changing. So our ideas or the theories that we have built over these years are not static. So they are not the truth. So there are theories, so they are changing. There are concepts, there are ideas, there are hypotheses that we build. So they are all subject to test and they're changing. Okay. In general, we don't see a civilization pre-Neolithic era. Okay. Okay. But there is a caveat to it. So why do we say that we don't see a pre-Neolithic era civilization, and what time period generally we call Neolithic? Okay, I'll be using a lot of these terms. Those are directly taken from European archaeology. Okay, based on European archaeology, a Neolithic period came somewhere around 12,000 to 10,000 BC. Okay, or 12,000 years ago, just to make it simple.
And if I made this period is dependent on the kind of human evolutionary period basically that we were at.
Yeah. So how do you identify that period? Is that your question?
Yeah. Yeah.
So Neolithic is the time when agriculture and domestication began, and we start seeing cultivated species, cultivated plants,
Okay.
cultivated animals. The stone tool technology also changed. So Neo is a new, Lithic is the stone tool technology. So it's a new stone tool technology. So now we see tools that are often used to clear forest and cut trees. Very broad definition of it. We also start seeing settled village. Now, whether there were no previous settled village, yes, there were, and I'll come to that point. So this is a general idea that with the agricultural production there came surplus. With the surplus there came civilization, because now we have a lot of resources. So generally, civilizations post dates the Neolithic period, the invent of agriculture. That was the idea. Okay. Now, recently, not recently, but it's been quite a few years, that archaeologists have found very complex societies in North America. Those are non-agriculturalist, so they are hunter-gatherer, but they used to build monuments. There were a lot of artworks that they have done, so which are monumental artworks, like not a monument in the sense that they were superstructures or something like that. They were artworks, a lot of artworks, that new artworks that they made, and they were monumental in nature. Like they're huge, and you need a lot of people, a lot of resources, a lot of labor planning, a lot of labor management.
So, if I may, these artworks are sorry, but these artworks are, for instance, in terms of like structures, or in terms of drawings, or in terms of.
So they are like circular to semicircular structures, semicircular mounds. Let's say mounds. So they were artwork.
Okay,
So they collected and accumulated mound and given it a structure. So if you see an aerial view, it will look like four series of C's. So like semicircles, kind of a thing. Okay. Or Stonehenge. Just give you an example of a Stonehenge is a similar kind of a monumental structure. Okay. But it was made of stone. It is stones that were erected, and those were lands that were accumulated to create the structure. So then we see this kind of settlements coming around, and those were seasonally occupied settlements. So, and archaeologists, we generally still don't quite understand why they were made in the first place. It is likely that there were some sort of ritualistic activities were going on, some sort of ceremonies were going on. It could be like a seasonal ceremony, where different tribes come together and then they perform a celebration together or perform some sort of ritual together, and that structures are part of that ritual. We don't know. But then those structures clearly indicate that they were complex, they were not simple. Okay. Can we call them civilizations? No, we cannot definitely call them civilizations, but they are inherently complex, more complex than archaeologists have identified hunter-gatherers in general. Okay. And then generally our understanding of this sort of subsistence and the kind of social structure that you need to maintain similar kind of a subsistence pattern were primarily coming from the analogies that we have taken from the Bushmen or from the Aboriginals of Africa. Okay, at that time we had very little knowledge about the Aboriginals from Australia, as well as the Aboriginals or Indians in that the Indians of America. But then when we have those information, then we see that a hunter-gatherer forager can be as complex as any modern society, and it's not that you need a very rudimentary and a very chiefdom to a very hierarchical social structure in order to maintain that subsistence. Right. So they could be as complex as them. And then and we were like it was not that they were only exploiting resources which are need for the immediate requirement. So what does that mean is that when you have agriculture, you have storage. You produce more than you need, and that extra becomes your resource that you generally exchange for whatever things you want in your life. Okay, that's even today is the case, that we produce more than we need, and that's the current economy. But in hunter-gatherer economy, we had a belief that that's a very need-based economy. That I will only hunt an animal, and I'll only exploit as much as I can consume. Obviously, there were no storage. Obviously, there were no refrigerator. So, if you kill a deer, you have to eat it, or there is no point of killing a deer. But then, and then because there was no ability of storage, and there's also a limited resources that are available in the forest. Like you don't have billions of deer in a forest, and when your entire diet is based on deer, it is pretty easily that you'll exploit all the deers and the forest will be empty. And that was one of the reasons that hunter gatherers were moving from areas to areas. They were seasonally moving, or they're moving with the herds that they had. And the surpluses can be used for various other purposes than just meeting your caloric need. Okay, you have surpluses that you can use for religious purposes. You have surpluses that you can use for feasting. You have also surpluses that you can use to show your supremacy. So the leader can come, the elite can generate from those kind of surpluses. I can throw a party just to show. And you see it in the modern days. How often you go to a party and you see, oh, this party is kind of a show off. He's just showing off how much money he has. He's showing off furniture, showing off food and all the stuff. So the showing off thing was there even in the ancient time, and these resources were kind of the source that you'd use to show off. And would you call these ideas primitive? Well, likely not. They were enough complex ideas. They were complicated thoughts, and they were the basic units that you need to develop a civilization. Okay. Now, when we call a civilization, it does not mean that there are definitely elites within that civilization. There are definitely commoners within this civilization, but within that civilization, there are also various economies that are going on at the same time. There are agriculturalists, there are economists, there are pastorals, there are craft producers, there are also hunters and gatherers that they were constantly, So coming back to the point, I said no, I'll go, I'll just spread my wings. But then coming back to the point, the concept of civilization, the modern concept of civilization that we have is definitely a post-Neolithic thing. So we don't have a pre-Neolithic or civilizations that were 14, 15, 16,000 years old. There could be, but we don't have that idea yet. We don't have that evidence yet. Now, the absence of evidence is not necessarily the evidence of absence, right? So we don't have that, but we may surely have it at some point of time. For history, there is someone who is telling you the story. There is a written record, like some form of a story is coming to you. There are folklores and stuff like that. If you're working with modern history, you have living memories of those events. But when you're going back in time, right? I think the longest memory that I have ever heard in my personal experience when I was working with the indigenous people from North America, they have a living memory of close to a few thousand years. Okay, because that information has been passed on from generation to generation to generation to generation. So there are people who would tell you the story of those years. But then when you are talking about 200,000 years, 300,000 years, 100,000 years, 50,000 years, even 10,000 years, there is no one else to tell you the story. So the story you have to reconstruct from the material or from the archaeological material that we find. So even though you think that you have been excavating that site forever, or Harappan sites were getting excavated in India for like over 100 years now. So don't we have all the answers? No. You have to ask the tool that we find to tell his story or her story or its story. You have to find the pot to tell its story. So, and then we have to let them speak. And then only we'll be able to reconstruct it, right? Because there's nobody telling us the story. So, and it takes time. It takes methodological development. It takes advanced scientific techniques. It also takes very strong theoretical understanding or theoretical regimes as well, and as well as a lot of work, a lot of experimental work, a lot of ethnographic work, a lot of understanding of human behavior in general, right? So it's a very complex process. So I don't know where I was, but what was my point? But that's what it is. It's like it's complicated.
Just a short note, given that you mentioned dating using fossils, can you tell us more about that, about what scientific or technical details it involves really when you actually are doing it? There is not really very clear information about the details available, or details that are involved in context of what is done at present, and also if there are any alternative ways apart from the primary ones that exist in the common knowledge, I guess.
So, say exactly, like dating plays a huge role in archaeology because we need to know how old things are, and that has been the primary goal of any archaeologist at any point of time. How old is this object? And we are fascinated about it. There are broadly two ways of identifying an age of something. Okay, and then as you come closer to the modern days, the dates are more precise. As you go in the past, the dates are more wide. Okay, let's say if you date a Harappan site, before I come to the dating, different kinds of dating, if you talk about Harappan site, so a date plus minus 50 years is fine. That's a 100-year range. Okay, so they say 200, 2300 plus minus 50 years is the date, a radiocarbon date. That's fine, like within 100 years. But when we talk about very old dates, then we are talking about 1.5 billions plus minus 200,000 years. Okay, that's the range of dates we can produce because we are going further in time. The most precise date we can do is using radiocarbon, right? The C14 dating, which is very popular, but it has its limitation. We cannot date anything older than 50,000 years. So that's where radiocarbon dates end. We cannot date anything older than 50,000 years within radiocarbon or AMS dates. Then we have to depend on other geological dates. So, say for example, OSL date, thermoluminescence date, potassium argon date, there are earth magnetism date, all these sorts of date, which would directly date the sediment that an object was found. So you can either date the object or you can date anything that is associated with the object. So radiocarbon date is often associated with the object. So you date the layer based on the radiocarbon, either from the charred remains, botanical remains, or animal remains, or any organic remains for that matter. Then when you go back in time, then you mostly date the sediment on which that particular object or particular fossil or particular tool has been found. Okay. Now, if you find a fossil, there are ways you can also date that particular fossil. Obviously, using geological method, so it not be that accurate, like 7,300,000 for 450 years. Not that kind of a calendar date, but it's a general, like let's say 7 million plus minus 300,000 years. So this kind of date you can do of the fossil, and then with the associated fossil, when you have a fossil, then you have associated finds. So there are now ways that you can date a stone tool. Okay, so basic idea of dating a stone tool would be it's again all luminescence dating, all different sorts of luminescence dating. So anything and everything absorbs light. So it's a very common way of dating now, apart from the radiocarbon. Everything and anything absorbs light, and then at certain radiation it emits the light. Okay, a good example would be when you drive during the night, you see all those stickers that kind of glitters, and then when light reflects on it, it glitters, right? But when there's no light, you will also see it's glittering, maybe to a lesser extent, but it's still glittering. That's the time when it's emitting the energy that it absorbed in the form of light. So it's still emitting the light. Now, by calculating the emission of that light, you would be able to say how long this is emitting the light, or when was the last time it got exposed to the light. Okay, that is the primary funda of luminescence dating. All sorts of luminescence dating, whether it's by light or by heat, whatever. Or and there is paleomagnetism, and I'll come to that later. Okay, so this is a luminescence dating. So what you can do, let's say you have taken a stone tool. Okay, you have taken a stone. Now the stone got exposed at certain time when the stone was built. Some volcanic activity happened and the stone get formed, or some other processes geological when the stone get formed, and that's the time the stone surface got the light. So if you date the stone, it will tell you the time when the stone came into existence. Okay. Now you flake the stone. Okay. Take a flake out of the stone. Now that surface that you created gets light again now. So now it is absorbing the light. Now you date, you date the light emission from that surface, that would tell you when the flake was taken out, not when the stone was formed. Does that make sense? Because it kind of resets the clock. Now it get exposed to the light, so it resets the clock. Okay. So that's how you date it. That's the same how you also date the sediment, mostly the quartz crystal and I think feldspar that are there in the sediment. You date them. It's the same concept is that when that particular particle was exposed to light for the last time, and then it gets buried and then it stays in the dark, so no exposure happens, and then you re-expose them to a certain light in the laboratory to kind of understand the emission rate, and then you'll know when there's the last time it got the light got emitted or light got reflected on that particular object or the particular particle. And it can be quite good kind of a dating, like in terms of its range. The modern samples would give you like 20-30 years of error, which is pretty good, but the older samples would give you a slightly larger error range, but it's still within a good frame. And then there is paleomagnetism. What is paleomagnetism? The north and the magnetic field of the earth is changing. So the north is turning to south and the south is turning to, it's always changing. So the sediment when it was formed would also indicate that current magnetism of that earth when it changed, and there was certain time that geologists have identified when that shift has happened. And using that paleomagnetism, that measuring the magnetic field of that particular particle, you would know, kind of get a sense of when this thing might have happened. That would also help you to identify the date. And then there are obviously global events. There was an earthquake that put a layer of a tectonic, there was a tectonic movement, and the layer from the lower geological level came on top. And then you find a hand axe underneath that layer, you would know, okay, this time that geological thing has happened, so this is definitely earlier or lower than that. There were volcanic eruptions, so there would be ash. The dating the ash, you would know if something you find underneath the ash, then it is older than the ash. If you find something younger than the ash, then it is younger. Off top of the ash, then it is younger than that. So these are kind of the basic methods of dating. So yeah, if you go deep into the time, the datings kind of gets complicated, and we're still trying to figuring out best ways of dating. So if you find a charcoal
Uh,
which is more than 50,000 years old, you cannot date it. It's pretty much useless at that point of time.
Now that we are discussing the technical aspects of the field of archaeology, so my question to you is a day in a field. Like, how do you do a field work? Like, what is the process of selecting an archaeological site? What methods go in the exploration, excavation? What tools you use? So if you can just shed some light on that.
Okay, so there are three kinds of archaeologists in general, or a mixture of the three. One is definitely who goes to the field, does exploration, excavations, and all sorts of field archaeology. Then there are lab archaeologists who would be spending most of their time in the lab. They would do some sort of field work, but even if they don't go for field work, they'll get samples and analyze the samples. Nowadays, I'm doing most of that. Okay, and then there are theoretical archaeologists who doesn't need samples, who doesn't need go to the field, or may can go to the exploration, but then they would mostly talk about developing theoretical understanding of the subject, and their lives would be very different. Okay, but I'll tell you, the most exciting life is definitely of a person, of an archaeologist who is be in the field. Okay, now when you be in the field, there are either of the two things you are doing. Either you're exploring or you're excavating. Now excavation is destruction in its nature. Okay, we are destroying a site. However systematically we do it, it's a destruction. Okay, I say that this is the best method to excavate. After 10 years somebody will come and was like, this guy even didn't know how to excavate, and he destroyed the completely destroyed the site. We scold people even today that this guy in like 1960s excavated that site and he hasn't recorded anything, because that was the best method available at that time and they didn't know about this. So whichever way you do it, however scientific it is wrong, and it is a distraction. So we prefer not to excavate. Okay, in general, archaeologists prefer not to excavate, not only because we are very concerned about preserving archaeology, it's a very costly affair. Okay, it needs a lot of money, it needs a lot of funding. Archaeologists are poor in general. So in general, we try to avoid excavation as much as we can. Even we excavate very small number of times. Exploration, on the other hand, is a very big deal, because you can gather a lot of information without even excavating a site, and that information can be gathered by collecting what is available in the site, doing some GPR surveys, so which is ground penetrating radar survey, magnetic surveys, and all sorts of surveys, digging small pits and stuff like that. So these are different activities archaeologists would do. Now, I'll tell you a day of an explorer. Okay. In a very general, in a very simple sense, not in a sense that you would expect that some Bollywood director would come and, "Yeah, I need the story." No, that's not the case. That's rarely the case. So somebody would go to a remote location, okay, wherever it is. So probably the nearest village or city would be like a few kilometers. So most of the time, you would go to a forest area or a river bank. You would primarily locate the areas where the high chances of finding sites. So what are the high chances? Next to a river, because it's a water source. So not only human, animals are also attracted to water. So that's the place where you'll find sites. Where do you find raw materials? If you're looking for Stone Age sites, where do you find good raw material? Okay, so you'll go and find sites there. Where you find enough resources like animals and plants and stuff like that, that's where you are expecting to find sites. So these are some of the locations, and there are many other criteria that you would look for. Elevations is one of them, temperature is one of them. So there are certain places which is more favorable by human, certain places which are not more favorable by human. But even in the periphery, there is a very strongly developed human culture right now. So don't underestimate that in any sense. But coming back to the point is that there are certain areas where you expect to find human being. Depending on your research question, whether you're looking for a Stone Age site, you're looking for a village site, most of the village sites in India or the post Neolithic sites are continuously occupied. So alluvial plain is a great place where you want to live because you want to cultivate, and that's the best land you have. That's the best place to raise your animals and stuff like that. You're a herding community, you would go to places like Kutch and Gujarat, though they are a little drier, but have an expansion of grassland. That's the best place you can live. And then Haryana, say for example, give you an example, has been occupied for centuries and thousands of years, and people are still living there, and it's a continuous occupation. So, but then Stone Age people would prefer certain areas where there are enough resources, next to the river where animals would come, they would hunt, and all sorts of. So we'll go to that place very generally. An archaeologist, they start very early. So before I joined Ashoka during my postdoc and PhD time, I was also working as a field director for a cultural resource management company. So just to give you a brief of cultural research, they are pretty much a salvage archaeology company who would salvage archaeological material before any sort of construction happens. Okay, so our job would be to go to the field, collect whatever is there, come back, and then the field is ready for any sort of construction. So my day would, let's say, during the field when I was there, my day would start around 4 a.m. I get ready by 5:30 a.m. Then I leave my home by 5:30 a.m. I had to drive 150 kilometers one way, start excavation at 8 a.m., continue my excavation till 5 a.m., and then I'll be back home by 7:30, 8 p.m. And then I'll just be dead as hell. But then in the field, in India, the excavations are primarily done by laborers that you hire for doing all this excavation work. ASI generally hires primarily laborers. Often universities do a little bit of excavations by themselves, again, because we are poor people and we don't have a lot of money. So most of the time, students will excavate, and then the excavation kind of academic excavations are slow. Okay, there would be, you may take like a month to excavate a centimeter of soil, but savage archaeology is fast because you have to savage whatever is there as quickly as you can. So you will be moving tons and tons of dirt all day just to excavate whatever is there. So you will be digging, and in North America there were no laborers, so we were the laborers, so field directors and field technicians, and sometimes darts are very heavy, so it's a very highly laborious job. And then, so that would be mostly the case. And then extremities of weather is something that is very problematic. I remember excavating sites starting from, so when we start our season, it would be around 20 degrees, then it goes all the way up to 40, 41 degrees even in Canada. Okay, so it's a cold country, but it can be pretty hot in summer. Even in Germany, you would know that it's in summer it gets pretty hot. So it would be in 40s, and then we'll excavate till the ground freezes. Okay, when we cannot dig anymore, the soil is that hard. So you put a shovel, it will just bounce back. So that would be a daytime temperature of, let's say, -2, -3, with knee height of snow, and you remove the snow and then you excavate, and it's wet. It's wet and cold. In India, I remember excavating a site in Haryana in the month of May and June. In the field 10 minutes, go to the tent, drink charge, come back. In the field 15 minutes, go to the tent, drink charge, come back. And then there is exploration. So most of the exploration are done in the month of summer. It's just because that time fields are open, there are no agriculture going on, and then you can see things on the surface. It's not raining, so there are less grass and stuff like that. It's a better weather in that sense. 40-degree, 45-degree, you have to walk 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers a day easily. So that would be a day, but then it's rewarding in a sense. You will find all sorts of things. You will find nature in a very different way that you have never experienced. And if you ask me, would you love to go field? I'll love to go field every day, because it's so fun over there. Because, and again, like, it's a teamwork. Archaeology is teamwork. Like, you'll rarely find an archaeologist doing his research in a closed room. It's not possible. Yes, there are, obviously, but it's a teamwork. So you'll be meeting people. It will be a fun workplace. You'll have fun. Can you imagine, like, you're excavating and finding a 7,000 years old fossil in your hand? It's so rewarding at that sense. So all this exploration, and you find new site, a completely new site. You explore unreachable areas, that there are caves and things that you cannot reach there, and things like that. And sometimes they would do all sorts of other exploratory circus, that we call, is that it's sometimes it's hard to reach areas that you have to go, and then you find all this weird stuff. I remember finding a monitor lizard inside my blanket in one of the fieldworks. So I was actually tired, and I came and I slept on my blanket, and I saw something is moving behind my back. I was like, what is that moving? And then I hold it from top of my blanket, and when I removed the blanket, there was a baby monitor lizard. I was like, great. uh, Scorpions, every time you'll find hundreds and thousands of scorpions. You move a stone, there's scorpion. So yeah, nature at one point of time, you'll be like, oh, that's a snake, that's fine, kind of a thing. And then there'll be people, like, I've heard people telling stories that they encounter tiger, they encounter all sorts of wild animals that are kind of preserved species that you don't see quite often. You see only in the jungles and stuff like that, cheetahs. And so yeah, that would be a general day in the field. It's like a lot of digging all day, and then a lot of fun in the evening, because you have basically nothing to do. So yeah, it's a very nice experience with wildlife, and then archaeology. When archaeology is there, then the wildlife is a definite bonus.
Before we dive into the research ideas, just wanted to make a small detour and ask you, given that you have these things that you work with every day, right? I'm quite convinced that your personal experiences in your everyday life must be heavily affected by it. Is it? If so, I mean, how are your general travel stories like? Or do you really look out for like archaeologically relevant stuff when you travel? And how does your personal life get affected by these academic ideas that you exercise on a daily basis?
So I'll tell you a funny story. Now, after so many years of experience, whenever I look into anything, I look from an academic perspective, right? Even so, I look for archaeological stuff. I would just look at you and look into your behavior and how you're behaving, so that I can infer something and apply to my research and kind of stuff. So, I was going to Europe. I was in a plane, okay, and there was a girl next to me, and then we were sitting. I haven't chat with her or anything. And then she was on the window seat, and I was on the aisle seat, and the window was open, and then we were going. Um, I believe there was either the north, it was very close to the North Pole, or there was some horseshoe lake, or there was some geological feature that was very interesting to me. And I was like, oh, did you see that? It's like this kind of feature and something. I forgot the entire story of it. And she was like, what? I was like, oh, no, forget about it. So it's kind of like sudden things you are so excited about, because why are you saying those nerdy things to me? But and you imagine, like, you don't know the person, and you suddenly start a conversation with that. So so, so yeah, these kind of things, like, you always get in a conversation which is very archaeology related, and sometimes that can make people feel awkward, right? But I mean, like, why would somebody come and tell, you show me a picture, and then I was like, "Here, do you see the nice picture?" I said, yeah. Do you know what kind of frame is that? I was like, yeah, I asked you to see the picture, not to look into the frame. So yeah, like, after being into the field so many years, and these things happen, and then you ask weird questions and stuff like that. But then it also shapes me quite a lot, because being in a team uh, makes you a great team player. So I can pretty much work with anybody. Has also exposed me to different parts of the world, different culture. I also look into culture in a very different way. I also look into human behavior in a very different way. It shapes me as a human being. Like, you pretty much put me anywhere in the world, I'll survive. So this is kind of what it does to your. But then I probably have the worst back. I have wounds in my fingers which are permanent now, and I have tans in my body which are like few years old and they're still there. So there are things like that. That also some tolls that you have to go through.
So, Professor, can you tell us about your research? Like, what did you do your PhD on? What area did you work on? And can you elaborate on that?
Okay, so that's a very big question. Okay, now you want to summarize my, say, 6 years into 10 minutes. Let me try. Okay.
You can take your time and just explain it to us.
Broadly, I worked in the Indus Valley region. Okay. Now, when I say Indus Valley, I know it will make some people upset. Like, why are you calling Indus Valley when all the Indus Valley sites are not in the Indus Valley? There are problems with nomenclature. Let's not go in there. There are problems. In the civilization, or Harappan civilization is the civilization that I worked on, or a portion of that is where I worked. My study area was Gujarat. So I did my PhD in Gujarat on a very small settlement. Okay. So when we talk about Harappan civilization, the names would come to your mind is like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro. To some people who are into these things, they will think like Dholavira, Rakhigari. These are huge, like big cities. Okay. I worked on a small settlement which is 3.5 hectare big, probably occupied for a few hundred years, not more than that. There are few people, maybe 50, 60 people living at that settlement, not more than that. They were not rich people, they were poor people like me living in there. So very common people settlement that I worked on. I try to be away from the shinier parts of archaeology and then work with the local people. I think the fun is there. Anyways, that's the site, or the time period that I worked on. Broadly speaking, I worked on a very specific time period that is around 2300 BC to 1900 BC. In broader Harappan archaeological sense, that would be the late mature Harappan period. So that's the time. So that's definitely the peak of the Indus civilization or the Harappan civilization, and also towards the end of the peak of the Harappan civilization. So when I started my research, I primarily wanted to understand what was the subsistence of Harappan people at that time. Now, am I the first person to asking that question? No, I was not the first person asking the question. There has been research going on that for many years. But then you can reconstruct the subsistence pattern of any settlement or any people from multiple sources. Okay. So I chose a different source. That source has never been chosen before. So I wanted to choose that source so that we can get some other information than what we already have. So generate new information. So that was the broader question that I have. Okay. Now that does not involve the theoretical interpretation that goes behind identifying the subsistence pattern. Okay. Now it is fine if I tell what you are eating, but it is more exciting when I tell why you are eating them. Okay. So now there is a why part of to that question. That obviously was not the known to me when I started my research, and then I kind of developed the why question and tried to answer that maybe very much towards the end of my PhD. So I wanted to look into the subsistence pattern from something, from a source that was never been utilized before. So what was my primary source was the residues. When you use a pot, I don't know if you have ever seen a pot being used. So if you think of a mud clay pot where you pour water, you see the pot gets wet. When you touch the pot, you feel it wet, right? That's because the water is percolating from the pot, and it's also keeping the water cold. So in general, any unglazed pot or pots that are not like porcelain, which is highly polished and stuff like that, they have this inherent quality of absorbing whatever is in there in the liquid form. So one thing that they absorb quite well are lipids, the fats in general. Okay, so they absorb obviously the carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and everything. But lipids are something that we have seen preserved quite well, for primarily because they do not dissolve in water. So water cannot take them out of the pottery. If they are there, they are there. So fats are for general people is like oils, fats, waxes. All these things come under fat lipids, and then there's the basic unit of it is fatty acid, so we can study the fatty acid. Also the lipids in their complex forms also sometimes can preserve in archaeological settlement. So by looking into the lipids, then I would be able to reconstruct the kind of food that were cooked in the vessel. Okay, because now we have a lipid profile, we can also do isotopes and stuff like that. Then I know what the kind of food that were stored or preserved or served or processed in that particular vessel. Now, what sort of extra information would that give me? Okay. So, what are the primary information we already had? We had obviously archaeozoological remains, so that are all the bones that human have consumed are there. We have plant remains mostly in the form of charred grains that are already there. So we know what were their kind of staple grains and stuff like that, what animals they consume. We also have roasted marks on the roasting marks, or the size of the bone would tell me, if they were made in small pieces to kind of boil, if they were large pieces, so they were roasted, if there were charred marks on the bone indicating roasting, or if there are other taphonomic marks in the bones that would indicate boiling, and then grains, if the grains were charred, and versus if the grains were made into flour and then they were used. So all sorts of things, information we already had. Now, a few information we did not have, and that's what exactly I wanted to know, because I wanted to reconstruct human animal behavior through looking into the subsistence. Okay. Now, why do I need to reconstruct human animal behavior in the first place? Because that would indicate, again, as I said, that we need to understand how human were thinking, how they're behaving, how they're employing their resources for all sorts of activities. So if we understand how human animal relationship, we would know how they are exploiting animals, we would know how they're raising their animals, we would know if there are any resources that are specifically assigned to raising the animals, or if they are led to raise free, what role animal played in their diet, what type of animal parts played the major role in their diet, and why. Okay, if there are certain occasions that some animals played a role, certain occasions some other animal part played a role, some animals were processed in some way, some animal processed in some other way, what were the other plant things that they have consumed. Like, let's say if they had a lot of oily nuts or oily seeds that they consumed, so that would also leave a lot of fat. So that would kind of give you a sense of the human environment interaction in general. And then you would know how environment modified the human, how human modified the environment, basically. So we have that capacity, right? So that was one of the question, is how human were modifying their current environment, or how to what extent human were dependent on their current environment to raise the animals or to manage their animals. So these were some of the bigger questions to finally understand the interaction system that were happening within the region. And I only did a part of it. Okay. Now coming back to the research, so then I was like, okay, fine. So let's go and look into the food and then figure out what are the things. So that was the question I came up with. And then my research had two different parts. One is to understand animal consumption, looking into the pottery residues, and understand animal herding practices by looking into the isotopes in animal remains. Okay. Briefly explain the topic. You are made up of what you are eating and where you are. Okay. Your chemical signature would clearly indicate what you are eating, or chemical signature within your body, what you are eating, and where in geologically where you are situated. Okay. So we can look into the isotopes of different molecules or different atoms, and then we would be able to tell that, okay, this is the kind of herding practice they have, this is the kind of environment that they lived on, or this is the kind of fodering practices they have, or this is the kind of migration pattern these animals would have. These are the three main things I wanted to do: understand from the isotopes and then from the lipid residues. So I did my study, and what I found is very interesting is that earlier people have argued that during the Indus period, the animals were extensively herded by or managed by human during the Harappan period. So what does that mean is that they were fed in a very controlled manner. They were not let to roam randomly and eat whatever they can. That was one of the argument that came before me, and then when I did my research, what I found is that at my site, yes, definitely some control feeding was there, but animals were also allowed to let roam freely and consuming whatever was there in the vicinity of the site. So what I found is that, during at my site at least, The feeding was kind of, they were controlled some extent whenever, and they were more like regional, seasonally varied. So when they had agricultural fodder, they would feed the animals agricultural fodder. When there were no agricultural fodder, they would let the animals roam around and eat whatever they want. Okay. Now that's a very opposite kind of a practice that, the other author have suggested. Now whether it is two different practices between these two different types of settlements, because mine is very smaller settlement versus there is a very slightly bigger settlement, is a different question altogether, and that we don't have the answer. Or is it, a very site specific, is very specific to my settlement only and how they have managed their animal, depending on how many animals and stuff they had. Also similarly, at the bigger side, we see cattle, specifically cattle coming from multiple locations. They were not only raised locally, but they were also getting animals from different places. And there was another study before that that also found, that's primarily focused on migration of human and animal. They also found that, cattle is one of the animal that kind of moved with human. So during the Harappan time, there were like females coming from different places, getting married to different people, and then they were moving. And along with the female, there were also cattle that were moving. So cattle were coming from different areas, at least at the bigger settlements. But now the question is, my site being small, was it that reason that, the cattle and the sheep goat that were raised at that site were regional, locally raised? So they don't have a varied isotope values that indicate that they were coming from somewhere else. Now, that could be just a part of the story because, again, I haven't analyzed everything. So there could be some cattle that are coming from there, but that's kind of thing what it is showing. Now, in terms of animal consumption, um, and there is a way you would know if animals were consumed for meat versus if animals were consumed for milk versus if animals were utilized for other secondary purposes. So, what would be the secondary purposes? Exploiting wool, using the animals for traction, all sorts of things. Not leather. Okay? Leather is a primary consumption because you have to kill the animal. So, by looking into the mortality profile of the animals, the age at death, you would know if animal were primarily consumed for meat or for secondary products. Okay, for secondary products, you would need an older animal, right? Because in order to exploit milk, you need an adult animal. For traction, you need an adult animal. So you will see a lot of old animal in your assembly. Versus if you extensively exploiting them for meat, then you will see very young animals, right? Because we all have said, hey, give me the tender meat and give me the young animal, because young animals are primarily tender. That's like early adult to adolescent kind of the age group. But secondary product would be a lot of old animals. But if they were extensively used for dairy, there would be a lot of young male that will get slaughtered. Okay, that's just because there's no role of a male cattle in a dairy industry, right? They just need like one or two male just to maintain the balance in the herd. But at Harappan's settlement, we don't have this age specific data, age and sex specific data. We have age data, but not sex specific data. So we did not know the cattle that were killed early in their age, whether they were male or they're female. But at the same time, we don't see a clear dairy practice because we don't see 50% cattle lived past their adulthood and 50% cattle died in their young. Because in a natural sense, you would expect equal number of male and female. Okay, whenever there are progenies, that's what you'll expect. No, it may change. It can get 40%, 60%, but it would not be like 99% and 1%. Then there is a problem, right? So that means if we just look into the mortality profile of the animal, we would expect if they are dairy that at least 50% or between 30 to 50% of the cattle will be dead in the first year of life because the whoever is doing the dairy industry, they don't need it. But we don't see that trend. So we know cattle were exploited for secondary product. We did not know what sort of secondary product. Okay. On the other hand, we know sheep goat were used for primarily for meat by looking into the mortality profile. But again, that's not a direct evidence. Okay, that's just the mortality profile. So this is the question then I took and I tried to understand it from the ceramic residues. Okay, because there are isotopic signatures, and that we already established earlier by looking into the animal isotopes. That looking into the isotopes of the food residues, would be able to say whether it's coming from cattle or whether it is coming from sheep goat. At the same time, by looking into the lipid residues and their isotopes, we would also know if it is meat or if it is milk. Okay. You would also be able to tell if it is fish, if it is, excuse me, if it is other plant products. But that was not my intent, and although I did that, but then it is not part of the main argument. It's just a extra bonus that I got along with. Uh, so what I found is that there were a lot of dairy consumed at that site. And interestingly, all the dairy that were consumed at that site were coming from cattle. They were not coming from sheep and goat. Whereas sheep and goat and other animals other than cattle, so that those are pigs and birds and stuff like that, they were the primary source of meat. At least the kind of meat that were processed in a pottery vessel. Okay. There were cattle meat as well, but they were few in number compared to the sheep goat meat. Now that there could be two reasons for that. One, that is that cattle were not the primary source of meat. It's understandable. Cattle is big. You need a large family for to feed to eat a complete cattle. So it is more beneficial to sacrifice them in ceremonial purposes. And we have evidences of that. You know that cattle were primarily chosen for ceremonial purposes as the primary source of meat. But then for a regular day of eating, you would never choose a cattle because then you would lose a lot of you'll waste a lot of meat. Whereas goats, a small goat, a baby goat is kind of good for a family of 10, 15 people. So that could be one of the reason. The other reason could be is that cattle meat were processed in some different way. So they were probably roasting a lot of cattle meat. That is also possible. So when you roast meat, then you don't necessarily use a pottery vessel. So there is no point of finding. There's no way you'll find the residue. But also there's also other possibilities that sampling bias. So the samples kind of I had indicated me that, although they were randomly selected, but then there's definitely sampling bias. So I have never got to the samples which had a lot of cattle. But even other studies that were done after me as well, they also haven't found a lot of cattle meat. So it is likely that either cattle were ceremonially consumed primarily or in ritualistic instances, or cattle were consumed in processed in some different way which does not involve pottery vessels. Okay. But the interesting finding was the dairy, and the dairy was coming from cattle, because not only that it indicates the usage of that animal, but also indicates the earliest usage of dairy, because there is a huge theoretical work going on whether secondary animal products played any role in the development of complex societies. Because again, as I told you earlier about the resources, so secondary product also can produce resources, a lot of resources, because you don't have to kill your animal. You can exploit it till it is kind of dead, right? So you can over exploit any animal, and you're seeing that how we are over exploiting animals nowadays as well. So there is this argument. So right now we only have direct evidence of dairy consumption in entire South Asia coming from the Harappan period. Well, is that the oldest? No, that's the known oldest date. There could be people before Harappans were also consuming dairy. We don't have that data yet. So that was my primary findings. Okay. Now the theoretical path that I went from this finding is that the regional raising of cattle, exploiting a lot of dairy, which kind of provide you resources, and because at the site of Kota Badli we don't see evidence of craft production, which is very common at many Harappan settlements. So they were not producing craft. There were also little evidence of that they were agriculturally producing something. They were probably doing some form of household agriculture, but not large scale agriculture. So they were probably not cultivating a lot of grain. So my argument is that dairy was likely to be the primary source of resource that they were exchanging and maintaining a local economy. Okay. And then they were definitely raising their animals locally, so they were permanently settled at the site. So they were not like nomad pastorals or anything. They're participating in regional activities and stuff like that. And then also because they show some sort of cultural differentiation or in terms of material culture compared to the Harappans, quote unquote. And there comes the center and periphery theory that I have proposed, and how that played a role in the interregional interaction. And but this kind of indicates that these are the kind of resources that were likely to be used and exchanged uh, in order to get other social benefits, social and economic benefits from the neighboring settlements. Okay. which could be either in terms of labor, which could be in terms of other resources that were not produced or available to the occupants of the settlement, but that would also be other resources, say for example agricultural products and stuff like that. Also that when you contribute something, you are part of the community, right? You are part of the system, so you need to contribute something. Other than that, you are not part of that corporate group. So this is kind of the goods that you would be using in terms of be into the corporate group, and this kind of shifts our idea from a very craft specialist Harappan identity that we have given from a top down view, very civilized settlements, civilization, but yeah, very standardized things, and they have measurements, craft production, long distance trade, all sorts of. But then we forgot to talk about this very rudimentary part of economy, which was the building block of this civilization, which is the building block of this regional connection, regional network. And there comes my theory of this cooperative regional interaction, where it is not that I come and exploit you. Is that okay? This is my part of the contribution, and that is your part of the contribution, and like nobody is exploiting anybody. Everybody is, contributing to that. This is kind of an economy which is very important to maintain the regional economy in the absence of a bureaucratic government, in the absence of someone sitting at Harappa or Mohenjo-daro or Rakhigarh or Dholapura controlling these regional groups, which we see on a later time. This is more of coming together and like, so you help me, I help you. So that's my theory. Is that right? Maybe not. I don't know. That's my theory.
I mean, this overview of sort of how the idea came in, and then how you collected the samples and so on. That's super interesting. There were so many things that we wanted to ask you. Due to the want of time, I think we would like to wrap soon. So I just wanted to ask you one question. When you're doing these things, and when you're actually like asking so many questions, and there are so many possible assumptions and ideas that you can go along, how does one sort of stop themselves from over interpreting things? Is there like a practice that you have to kind of remind your brain about, or is there something that you know as like a professional, I don't know, training? It's a part of a professional training that you have, or something of that sort. Like how do you sort of wrap things up in a way that you're not over interpreting, but you're still enough that you've used all the ideas and it's all like a tiny, like a proper little tight bow.
I think that's the problem of every PhD student in this world. Is when should I stop my research? At what point that is enough? I would say you probably have more personal reasons to stop that research than your academic reasons. There is no concrete answer. Is that when you stop your research, because questions are never ending. You ask a question, you do a research, that leads to another question. That leads to another question. So question would be never ending, and if you want to, nobody in their lifetime can answer all the questions. So one rule of the thumb, I believe, is that you ask a question. Once you get a satisfactory answer of that particular question, stop asking another question. Put those extra question into your future research. If the question you started with, stick to that. You found the answer. You didn't find the answer, fine. That's end. End it there. I think I have a funny story of finishing my research. I did not write a thesis. Okay, so my PhD was not a thesis PhD. My PhD was a three-paper PhD thesis. So I had to convince my supervisor that I am not writing a thesis. I hate writing. I'm not writing a thesis. I'll write three papers, and then that's my thesis. So there I drew my life. I have questions like I'm still working on materials that I have collected during my PhD and still analyzing them. So there's no end to it. So yeah, you draw your own boundary. Whatever reason it is, I'm getting old. Okay, finish my PhD. Okay, I have a child. Finish my PhD. I don't have money. Finish my PhD. So that's what I'm saying. Like you have more personal reasons to finish your PhD than you have more academic or academic reason to finish your PhD. So yeah, I think that's the problem for everyone, anybody in the PhD.
Would you have any concluding notes relating to the state of the field in India currently? And what exactly is the structure like currently? I mean, what exactly is the structure like at present, and what does an everyday look like for an archaeologist, even perhaps in context also with popular culture ideas and so on? How true are they, and how is it like really when you live that?
What I would want to give a concluding statement from my side, it would be that in India we are still developing this field. Okay, this field has not been developing, especially when we consider archaeological science and archaeological theory. They both sucks at this point of time, and we really need to work as group, collaborate with people, collaborate with scientists, collaborate with theorists to kind of come up with very strong theoretical backing of scientific facts. That's what we need in India right now. So I would ask my students, if whenever I start my PhD student, is that do interdisciplinary research. Don't focus yourself doing just archaeological research, because archaeology is interdisciplinary. Human is interdisciplinary. You can research on a human or a society from one point of view. So broaden your point of view, do research, and then only will get new information. So theoretical backing we are lacking. So we need very strong theoretical backing, very strong interpretative archaeology. It may sound like slightly overboarding with the data, which is also fine. Like, you can go overboard with the data. It's your theory at the end of the day. When you are talking about theoretical, people will agree or disagree. Like, don't think that it's your child, it's just a theory that you came up with. So if somebody disagree with to that, it's perfectly fine, because that's just a theory. But then you have to have this interdisciplinary aspect. Now the second point is, when we talk about movie, I know many people would say that the movie did not represent archaeology properly. No, a movie doesn't have to represent archaeology properly. That's not the role of a movie. Then you make a documentary. If you're making a movie, you have scope to go wild. You have scope to say unwanted theories, and get your imagination. If I tell you all about Harappans in an academic way, they would sound dry. Like, they wouldn't sound very exciting. You would just think, oh, they are just normal village people, and nobody would want to watch that kind of a movie. So I want to go to cinema hall to watch a movie and come back being entertained. Right? Archaeology is a discipline. It's not an entertaining media, so you cannot entertain someone with academics. Very, very difficult. So I don't have problem. Go wild with archaeology, and with now CGI and all. I would say go wild. Come up with concepts. If you inspire archaeologists to build a high-tech laboratory that would look like that, why not? So inspire us, surprise us in any way you can.
This was a conversation from the 4th season of Zeroing In, the science podcast, where we are delving into the ideas of a city tracing along the shores of the evolutionary history of human civilizations. We would like to thank Professor Kalyan Chakraborty for this exciting discussion and the curious conversation that took us along through a journey across millennia and what we know of them as people who belong. On behalf of the Zeroing In team for this episode, which included Muskan Garg, Sahil Mitchell, along with the season team for Zeroing In, and I am Naman Chen. Thanks a lot for listening to this episode. We'll be back with a new episode along the same ideas with further interesting questions and conversations with eminent Indian scientists and researchers from across the world. If you have any suggestions, you can visit us on zeroingin.org or write to us on zeroingin@gmail.com and follow us on our Instagram and Facebook handles for regular updates. Until the next time.